It's been a very busy offseason for the Boston Bruins, including losing some key players. But how good are the Bruins now? Ian McLaren of Locked On Bruins joins us to talk about that and all things Boston Bruins next on the Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Boston Bruins, Ian McLaren. And Ian, been a very busy, eventful offseason. And I guess outsiders would be concentrating more on some of the players the Bruins lost this offseason. Out of all of those guys, who concerns you the most?
I mean, I guess the guy that you would look at first and foremost is Linus Ullmark. I wouldn't classify that as a loss per se, seeing as the Bruins actively decided to trade him to the Ottawa Senators, but subtracting him from the roster is certainly going to be an issue for this team. We'll talk about that later on when we discuss the goalie situation. In terms of actual losses, guys who chose to move on and sign elsewhere, Jake DeBrusk obviously is a big one. He had been drafted by the Bruins, developed by the Bruins, didn't quite reach his offensive potential as a member of the Boston Bruins, but he became a very valuable two-way forward for this team. And he, along with Danton Heinen, who both signed with the Vancouver Canucks, those are two big losses for this team, especially on the wing. Now, they did add Elias Lindholm, who is going to be, a foundational player down the middle for this team for the next several years. But Jake DeBrusk specifically had, just a couple years ago, he was one of their most productive players when he was positioned alongside Brad Marchand and Patrice Bergeron. Had a very successful stint there, and losing him, especially, again, a guy they had drafted, developed, he had played his whole career there. That's a pretty big loss for the Bruins, for sure.
How about Pat Maroon? How do you feel about that loss, and how do you replace a guy like that?
Yeah, he was only here for a brief time, and his tenure with the Bruins was kind of tempered by the fact that he was coming off back surgery. It didn't play a whole lot, but he became a pretty instant fan favorite for this team, which is pretty wild considering just a handful of years ago, he was one of the fan base's mortal enemies with the St. Louis Blues and leading them to a Stanley Cup. And even in his time back with the Tampa Bay Lightning, they brought in a couple of younger guys to play in the bottom six. A guy like Max Jones, they're hoping could maybe fill that role with a bit more upside. Mark Kastelic, who was part of the Linus Ullmark trade, he's going to be given a shot to play on the fourth line and perhaps fill that more physically intimidating part of Pat Maroon's role. He was really embraced by the team, by the teammates. Even Brad Marchand as captain really said he enjoyed having him around. And Pat Maroon himself even said he had one of the best times of his career in that short stint, which says a lot considering he's a multi-Stanley Cup winner. That was a tough loss, kind of a short and sweet time there. But everybody's kind of moving on from Pat Maroon at this point as well.
Talk to me about the Ullmark trade. Were you pleased with the return that the Bruins got, and what is the new goalie situation going to look like?
I think the Bruins getting back a first-round pick, that was the whole impetus for making the trade, and they actually got back the pick that they had originally owned that had come to the Senators by way of the Detroit Red Wings, and that had been part of the Tyler Bertuzzi trade. So getting a first-round pick, it was still a bit of a later first-round pick, but to get back in the draft to kind of help restore some of the pipeline, and to get a guy like Kostelic, who's a versatile winger, bottom six guy. And then, of course, the kind of surprising bit in the trade was getting Joonas Korpisalo back in the deal from the Ottawa Senators. My picture for this trade was to be kind of dumping that $5 million on the remaining year of Ullmark's contract and kind of reinvesting that in Jeremy Swayman contract, something that still remains up in the air at this point. But to bring Korpisalo back at, the Senators retain, but they're still on the hook for 4 years at $3 million. That to me was an eyebrow raiser, and really hoping that goalie coach Bob Essensa can work some of the magic that he showed in the past. You look at the Bruins goaltending situation over the past 15 years, and it's been almost immaculate. And that's really due to goalie coach Bob Essensa and his work with these guys. So hopefully Korpisalo can turn things around and be at least serviceable backup, because if not, that contract could become pretty problematic fairly soon. So overall, I was glad to get back in the first round. My vision again was that, okay, you dump Ullmark and then you immediately sign Swayman with that savings. That didn't come to pass. They still have Korpisalo on the books for quite a while, and the Swayman contract still has not been signed, so it hasn't quite fallen into place as I expected it would have.
How do you envision the starts being divided this year between Swayman and Korpisalo?
Yeah, I mean, the last couple of years it had been a almost even split between Ullmark and Swayman, but based on Korpisalo's performance last year with the Ottawa Senators, I would think that Swayman would at least be in line for 50 starts this season, and perhaps more of a 65-35 split or a 70%, 30% split. And I think that actually is coming into play in terms of the contract negotiations. Jeremy Swayman, everybody with eyeballs can see that Jeremy Swayman is a 1A goalie who NHL Network just ranked him as the 4th best goalie in the NHL right now. But we haven't actually seen him pick up the ball and run with it, or he hasn't been given the opportunity to get an extended run of starts. So maybe the Bruins are thinking, well, we need to see that in action before we commit 9, 8, 10, whatever $million. So it's kind of a catch-22 at the moment. But I mean, based on how Korpisalo played last year, how Swayman has played over the course of his career, especially in the playoffs last year, I'd be giving him at least 2 out of every 3 starts here for the Bruins this coming season.
The Bruins have been a veteran team, a team that has won consistently in the past decade. Are there any breakout players, young guys who have a shot at making this roster and having an impact this year?
Yeah, the guy you look at right away is Fabian Lysell. Like I mentioned, with DeBrusk leaving, there's a really big hole in the top 6 for this team right now. There's an opportunity for a guy like Fabian Lysell, who was drafted in the first round a few years ago, got a year in junior. He's got a couple of years in the AHL under his belt, and he should be ready to jump in and challenge for a spot, perhaps alongside Marchand and Charlie Coyle on the team's second line. So that's a guy who could step in and make an impact right away. He's got all the offensive tools. He was kind of questioned last year for his two-way play. I mean, he's only 21 years old. Takes time to develop that part of his game as well. But in the right spot, I think he could break out. A guy like Trent Frederick as well. He's been kind of limited on a third line role. Hasn't really got a lot of power play time, but with DeBrusk gone, with James Van Riemsdyk questionable as well, as unsigned, maybe he comes back at some point on a PTO or when the Swayman contract is resolved. But if Frederick can get into the top 6 and can get some power play time, he's the guy that could really break out this season for the Boston Bruins as well.
All right, Ian, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
The podcast is available on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. Just look up Locked On Boston Bruins, Locked NHL Bruins on social media, and people can find me at Ian C. McLaren.
Ian, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, no problem, Gil. Always great to catch up.
Today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers.